Recording in progress. the price of a crisis that they have not created. However, these countries are not playing the victim card. They are investing significant resources of their own to address and mitigate the impact of climate change.
The theme of this year's African Economic Conference, Supporting Climate Smart Development in Africa, builds on the outcomes of COP27 to enable established academics and young researchers alike to present solution-oriented research to policymakers and decision makers on how to strengthen Africa's response to climate change and its ripple effects.
This conference is a unique one to allow policymakers, leaders, the private sector, and African youths and women and researchers to discuss how Africa can move forward to mobilize resources for supporting climate smart development in Africa, to do research and innovation to produce technologies that will allow Africa to leapfrog its development in the new development transitions, and bring African women and youths opportunities that come from climate change.
We must flip the development script and create new models that are fit for a climate-smart future.
This conference is about bold, homegrown solutions and action-oriented approaches that boost growth, foster energy transition, and climate-smart agriculture. We must develop sustainably now to safeguard our future.
And of course, a big win for emerging markets was that loss and damage funding is firmly on the agenda for COP28. Of course, we still have to see who's going to put the money in and how that money is going to be dispersed, but it is on the agenda for COP28. Before we go any further, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our spoken word artist, Ms. Zainab Soifu.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. Perhaps you know me for the gazelles of savannah or for the camels of Sahara. I'm no stranger. My name is Africa. Africa is my name. But if only you would read in the wrinkles of my face the frenzy fear of the feverish degrees Celsius, you would see that I often feel afraid and anxious. Gone are the days of only 4 seasons. Now I only experience a cacophony of emotions. That sweet spot where I once counted seashells is now swallowed by waves of emotions. A dreadful drought in my throat as I spend a thirsty night in South Sudan. Anger floods my thoughts as I realize my saliva is all there is if I want to spend another 30 days alive. My heart cries for the islands, Mauritius, Madagascar, and the Seychelles. I wonder how much more will they struggle to keep their head above the waters. My hand reaches out to the farmer's land, one which nourishes and nurtures, soon to become bare and barren. Within me is a hurricane, a storm of persistent pain, screaming that climate crisis is an injustice, for we do not deserve to pay the price of other continents' polluted purchase. Alas, climate change has gone way too far for us to play the blame game. So today, I stand not before you, but among you, not as an isolated continent, but as part of the whole planet. I beseech you to lift the veil of denial, because it's easy to say that I am playing the victim while I'm only avoiding the venoms of survival. Let's take a vow to honor, to honest, and to heal the world. Let's take a vow not in a whisper, for the world is too loud to hear us murmur. Let's raise our voice like Victoria, who rose between Zimbabwe and Zambia. For there are within us deafening lions who are as faint and fragile as famished children. Let's water the great green wall until it becomes a witness that we were not engulfed by greed, but we rose with grace, that we were not wrong to believe that there is still hope in the human race. Thank you.
Thank you so much for focusing us so beautifully, Zainab, on the agenda at hand, and that is, of course, climate change. I'd now like to call on the Minister of Finance, Economic Planning and Development of the Republic of Mauritius, the Honorable Dr. Padiachi, for welcome.
Merci. L'honorable Pravin Kumar Jagnat, Premier ministre de la République de Maurice.
Thank you very much, Honorable Pravin Kumar Jagnat, Prime Minister of Mauritius, Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency ambassadors, my friend Kevin from the African Development Bank, Dr. Anna Morsi, Deputy Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, Mr. Achille Tena, Deputy Executive Secretary General of the United Nations Economic Commission, Mr. Administrator in charge of development. Dear friends, all protocol observed, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's an honor to welcome you to Mauritius for the 17th edition of the African Economic Conference. Allow me to recognize the presence of the 200 international delegates who made the trip, as well as that of all the other participants connected currently. As you know, these 3 days will be focusing on the theme supporting climate smart development in Africa. As COP27 ends, COP27, which held for the very first time in history on our continent in Egypt, this theme is quite timely. To highlight its relevance, allow me to start with the salient conclusions of the 6th report of the UNFCCC, which was published in 2022. By 2030, that's in barely 8 years, 132 million people around the world could fall into extreme poverty due to climate change. On the continent, agricultural production has already dropped by 34% from the 1960s, and this is due to climate change. This is more significant than in any other region across the world. In macroeconomic terms, the added value in Africa has dropped by 13.6% from 1991 to 2010 compared to what it ought to be if human-induced climate change had not been made. Ladies and gentlemen, in light of the context displayed before us and the severity thereof, our continent is forced to build resilience against climate change, especially social and infrastructural resilience, in order to achieve its development goals. That is why we meet today. We are to carry Africa's voice together and shift national successes into examples of good practices for the continent. Ladies and gentlemen, the government of Mauritius under the direction of Honorable Prajna, has made climate change not just an obstacle to its action, but a driver for economic growth and social progress. Thus, Mauritius, as one of the first countries in the world which ratified the Paris Agreement, has placed as objective 60% of renewable energy by 2030. In order to achieve this, we have included in our budget for 2022-2023 the implementation of the Green Transformation Package that will lead to sustainable investment to the tune of 20 billion rupee. Within the framework, as part of or against the background of the rise in oil prices, and in order to enhance neutral carbon transport, we cancelled all duty costs on hybrid and electric vehicles, and even introduced a regime for negative assets of 10% for private vehicles for individuals to a max of 200 rupee. Mauritius is implementing a regulatory framework for social development. This framework, which will be operational in the coming weeks, will facilitate the emission of such bonds by the Mauritius government. In light of such initiatives, it is obvious that this government, under the leadership of our Prime Minister, has made inclusive and robust sustainable development the watchword of its action. And as such, even despite the COVID-19 pandemic, and even today, in spite of the Ukrainian crisis, may we recall that Mauritius, a small island economy, which is really open to the world, has been hard hit by the pandemic. In light of the worst crisis in our history, our economy regressed by 15% in 2020. But we were able to increase our GDP by to the tune of 30%, and we supported our population. Choosing development rather than austerity was the right choice and bore fruits. As such, by 2022, our GDP will grow by 7% in 2022 and even more later, with a GDP that will grow beyond 500 million rupee for investments, standing at over 100 billion rupee for the year 2022. Thus, we can be proud and say proudly that the COVID-19 chapter is now behind us. Ladies and gentlemen, as Mauritius, just like the African continent, is struggling to strengthen its resilience in the face of exogenous shocks, we must come together and act against climate change. The adoption of the Green Program for Africa by the Executive Commission for Africa heralds a better future for the continent. In order to turn this into a reality, we need to march against a climate war that is unprecedented. We must mobilize ourselves and find ways to obtain more funds and build capacities with the support of our partners. With the support of such partners of the AFDB or the World Bank. Ladies and gentlemen, this conference provides a golden opportunity to fast-track this process. Let's seize such an opportunity. We only have one planet, and it is this call for mobilization that allows me to conclude with a statement by Jacques Chirac, a friend of Africa. Our
Economic Commission for Africa, Dr. Morsi.
Good morning, Your Excellency, Honorable Pravant Kumar Jugnauth, Prime Minister of the Republic of Mauritius, Honorable Minister of Finance of Mauritius, dear colleagues, Kevin Urama, Acting Vice President and Chief Economist of African Development Bank, my dear sister, Ahuna, Assistant Administrator and Regional Director for Africa at UNDP, Honorable Ministers, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to first give sincere thanks and appreciation for the government and people of Mauritius for hosting this very important conference and for the warm hospitality they have accorded to all participants. The Economic Commission for Africa is delighted to jointly organize the 17th session of the African Economic Conference in partnership with the African Development Bank and UNDP to contribute in addressing the transformational challenges that the continent faces. The theme of this year's conference, focusing on supporting climate-smart development in Africa, is quite timely, as it comes right after the COP27 that was held in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, a month ago, and that was seen as an African COP focused on implementation. This conference provides us an opportunity to digest, synthesize the discussions that we had at COP27 and propose recommendations for how to support climate-smart development in Africa. We're meeting at a time when African economies have actually been facing tsunami of global shocks, emanating from the COVID-19 pandemic, then the war in Ukraine, and exacerbated by the challenges posed by climate change that is hard-hitting for African countries and communities. We know how the COVID-19 had disproportionate impact on the continent, pushing 55 million people into extreme poverty and really reversing hard-won gains that have been achieved over the earlier 2 decades. It increased new poor by 55 million and added 46 million people to those at risk of hunger and malnutrition. Then we were hit by the war in Ukraine, which compounded economic uncertainties affecting low and middle income countries. This included the impact of increasing fuel prices, disruptions in supply chains, and also impacted access to markets and disrupted African food systems. The situation is even further exacerbated by increasing and adverse impact of climate change on the continent, which poses existential threat to the continent and could reverse some of the SDGs progress that has been achieved and aspirations of the African Union's Agenda 2063. Africa needs to close huge development gaps by investing substantially in key sectors, such as energy, agriculture, transport, water, among others. These sectors are very vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change. The annual economic costs of extreme weather events in Africa are projected at 45 to 50 billion US dollars by 2040. And up to 70% of Africa's annual GDP on average by the year 2100. These challenges put Africa in a quite difficult development position. The continent needs trillions of dollars to close huge development gaps. For example, it's estimated that investment in the order of 170 billion US dollars per year needed to come from private sector for key infrastructure areas. So how can we build confidence that these investments will deliver services and not become stranded by climate change impacts? i.e., how can we have climate smart development? 47 African countries have so far submitted their revised nationally determined contributions to climate action ahead of the global stocktaking on climate actions next year under the UNFCCC process. These nationally determined contributions require close to $3 trillion to implement. But African countries need support to translate their NDCs into bankable investments and projects that can attract financing from the private sector. And this is particularly so when these NDCs are revised to enhance ambition with clean energy, climate smart agriculture, and green industrialization actions that can readily attract ESG financing. In fact, the Economic Commission for Africa has been working on SDG 7 initiative for Africa, which has demonstrated that this, with the issuance last year by PEMCO and South Africa of 3 billion rand local currency green bond to support investments in renewables in the country. But for more of these investments to actually happen, countries must also take the effort to address policy and regulatory challenges, to remove barriers to investment, and with the de-risking tools and instruments, as well as with capacity for enhanced liquidity that reduces sovereign cost of borrowing, as has been illustrated by the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility that the Economic Commission for Africa recently created and is now fully operational and independent. Other areas of support that ECA has been providing member states include, and we have a large variety, but let me just highlight a few, include work with partners on sustainable energy for all to support development of just transition plans in countries. It also includes work with partners to leverage the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement to use Africa's abundant clean energy resources to transform minerals and produce electric battery precursors in DRC. It also includes the implementation of the sustainable budgeting approaches and helping countries roll them to help improve mainstreaming of climate resilience into budgetary process. And it also includes work on Great Blue Wall and on debt for nature and debt for climate swaps. Our work also included supporting the development of carbon markets in Africa through creating common registry and harmonizing protocols to facilitate resource mobilization through voluntary carbon markets. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, climate smart development in Africa is the only development model that will unleash the continent's potential to achieve its development aspirations. It is possible, especially in the context of strengthened multilateralism, to tackle climate change and eradicate poverty. But African countries must build sustainable and resilient economies by enhancing their design and implementation of credible macroeconomic frameworks, must reduce dependence on external debt, take advantage of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement to really accelerate industrialization and diversification. They need to ensure a just and equitable energy transition that capitalizes on the continent's abundant renewable energy resources and critical minerals. They need to build agricultural and food systems that are resilient to external shocks. And they need to invest in production and uptake of climate information services, as well as early warning systems. Many papers have been submitted to this conference on these matters, and I take this opportunity to thank all the young researchers who have put a lot of hard work in bringing their research to this conference. We also have many exciting and insightful plenary sessions that will shed light on much more on addressing issues of climate change and development in Africa. And I'm really excited to follow the various sessions and look very much forward to the outcomes of the 17th session of the African Economic Conference. Thank you for your attention.
Up next, we have Ms. Ahuna Izia Konwa. She's the Assistant Secretary General, Assistant Administrator, the Regional Director for Africa, United Nations Development Programme. Please, could you come up to stage? Thank you very much. We can give her a warm welcome.
Good morning, Your Excellency, Pravind Kumar Jagannath, Prime Minister of the Republic of Mauritius, Your Excellency, Dr. the Honorable Padayachi, Minister of Finance, Economic Planning and Development, my dear sister, Dr. Hanan Morsi, Deputy Executive Secretary and Chief Economist at the UNECA, and of course, my brother here, Professor Kevin Urama of the AFDB, distinguished and our guest today. I want to join Dr. Morsi in really thanking the government and people of Mauritius for having us here. I've been on the ground myself for about 3 days, and I'm now convinced that this was the right choice for this conference. A country that is indeed demonstrating the miracle of development and the future of development at the same time. Strong institutions, deepening democratic culture, and a desire really to make development not only sustainable, but also inclusive. We should all be proud of the journey that Mauritius, this large ocean country, has been on, and the examples that we could pick up from here. It is truly a privilege to be joining the Africa Development Bank and the ECA for the 17th edition of the Africa Economic Conference. This conference takes place as people across Africa are witnessing multiple economic and non-economic shocks that are hitting simultaneously. Surging food and energy prices are causing what we now hear our UN Secretary General describe as a cost of living crisis across Africa, across the world, pushing millions back into poverty and indeed reversing many development gains that we have achieved over the decades. In 2022, we have seen a climate emergency hitting with increasing intensity. At the same time, climate change-induced drought is precipitating hunger and in some cases threatening famine in regions such as the Horn of Africa. Indeed, the socioeconomic impact of the continuing COVID-19 pandemic, as we heard from the Minister of Finance, will reverberate for decades to come. And it has been really aptly described as an era of polycrisis. An analysis that we have done at UNDP shows that some 54 developing countries worldwide are strangled by soaring debt levels. They are unable to respond and to recover from these multiple crises. And of these countries, 25 are in our region in Africa. And this is why the theme of this 17th edition of the conference, which is supporting climate smart development in Africa, is both timely and extremely relevant. And it's important that we emphasize that Africa's path to attaining the Sustainable Development Goals must be climate smart. Protecting the planet and supporting the people of Africa to exit multidimensional poverty is not just an option, it is an urgent priority. And in this age of uncertainty, ladies and gentlemen, I want to highlight 4 key areas of focus that will drive climate smart development across the continent of Africa. The first is that climate change is the defining challenge of our time. With COP27 now over, it did not achieve the drastic reduction of emissions that the world needs, but it did see the establishment of funding arrangements for loss and damage, which countries like Mauritius that are increasingly vulnerable to climate effects without actually contributing largely to it can now benefit from if it is indeed implemented. And I think we should all make it a business to ensure that the loss and damage fund becomes a reality. Through a climate promise, UNDP is supporting 44 countries on the African continent to implement bold, nationally determined contributions as sovereign investment plans. Consider Mauritius, which aims to achieve 60% of energy production from green sources by 2030. This is ambitious, Your Excellency, but it is achievable if the world comes behind you, such a bold step, and supports you with technology, with financing, and with goodwill. Such climate action will be funded from public and private sector finance, and we have to insist that it gets that financing. Indeed, digital technology and innovation will be key tools in our fight against climate change. That is the thinking behind the UNDP Accelerator Lab networks, and we have one here in your country, Your Excellency. We're active in 37 countries on the continent, and it is working with local communities to scale up homegrown development solutions. We believe that the solutions for Africa's challenges are here on the continent, and we've got to harness that solution, tap into its scale, and scope it. Second, the UN and our partners are working to drive a just transition away from fossil fuels and ensure that millions of people across Africa can access clean, renewable energies and the opportunities that it brings. UNDP has committed to a bold target to bring electricity access to an additional 500 million people globally by 2025. Approximately 300 million of these people are living in Africa. The new Africa Mini-Grids program is a clear demonstration that deploying large-scale renewable energy is possible. A partnership between the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, the United Nations Development Program, and the Africa Development Bank, and of course the Rocky Mountain Institute. The program will support new solar battery mini-grids markets in 21 countries in Africa. Third, Africa needs climate-smart agriculture to bolster food security. And the war in Ukraine has cruelly been a stark reminder that Africa can no longer continue to rely so heavily on imports to feed a growing population. In Zambia, ladies and gentlemen, the UN family and the Green Climate Fund are working to support communities to leverage technology and a new growing technology series to boost food security. These are examples of what we can do, because today that program has benefited 200,000 smallholder farmers. Yet the potential remains immense. Africa, which possesses 60% of the world's arable land, holds the potential to feed the world, now numbering some 8 billion people while driving economic growth. Fourth and final is that finance is key, and UNDP is supporting vehicles to put cheaper money in the hands of both individuals and governments. That includes implementing what we now call the integrated national financing frameworks in 36 countries in Africa with the rest of the UN family, aligning with development finance that supports the sustainable development goals. 2 days ago, Your Excellency, we launched the SDG investor maps for Mauritius. UNDP is working closely with the private sector to make hundreds of new SDG-aligned investments in countries on the continent. The UN is supporting countries to innovate in the financial sphere because we need financing, not just funding. Look, for instance, to the Development Bank of Rwanda, which is preparing its first green bond with UNDP support. It aims to inject around $50 million into key areas like renewable energy and biodiversity conservation. UNDP is also supporting countries to make new strategic investments in burgeoning African continental free trade area, everywhere from Uganda to Mauritania, Senegal to Mauritius, all with domestic resource mobilization. Most of all of this work done by key groupings such as the G7 and G20 to mobilize debt relief and channel much needed resources to Africa. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, countries across Africa are now exiting the age of aid. We have to go beyond aid. As the continent moves towards an era of investment that drives prosperity in a shared way, all communities must be able to access and benefit from the supply chains of the new global green economy, including clean energy and food systems, not just outside investors. The 2022 Africa Sustainable Development Report, which is going to be launched at this conference, aims to provide new insights into how we accelerate these aims. Crucially, UNDP, the UN family, and key partners such as the African Union are working with communities across Africa to use decarbonization as a driver for development. In many ways, this represents our ladder to a greener, a more inclusive, and a more sustainable future for all. I thank you.
And I think we've heard that call, growth beyond aid, over and over again, and I'm sure it will be a strong feature of today's sessions. I'd now like to call on the Vice President, Acting Chief Economist of the African Development Bank, Kevin Urama, to welcome us on behalf of the President of the African Development Bank, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina.
Honorable Pravin Kumar Jugnauth, Prime Minister of the Republic of Mauritius. Honorables Louis Stephen Obegadu, Deputy Prime Minister of the Republic of Mauritius. Dr. the Honorable Ranganathan Padachi, Minister of Finance, Economic Planning and Development, Republic of Mauritius, and the Governor for the African Development Bank Group. His Excellency, Mr. Flavien Juba, Minister of Agriculture, Climate Change and Environment, Republic of Seychelles. His Excellency, Ms. Aminata Assome Diatta, former Minister of Trade, Republic of Senegal. Ms. Ahuna Ezia-Kongwa, my sister, Assistant Administrator, Regional Director for Africa, United Nations Development Program. Dr. Anand Morsi, Deputy Executive Secretary and Chief Economist, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Dr. Victoria Kwakwa, Vice President for Eastern and Southern Africa, World Bank Group. Dr. Marit Kitar, Interim Director of the African Minerals Development Center, representing His Excellency, Mr. Musa Faki Mahamat, Chairperson of the African Union Commission. Members of the Diplomatic Corps accredited to the Republic of Mauritius, senior officials of the Republic of Mauritius, distinguished guests, members of the press, dear fellow researchers in the room, ladies and gentlemen. I bring you greetings of Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, the President of the African Development Bank Group, also known as Africa's Optimist-in-Chief. I wish to, on his behalf, especially thank His Excellency, Mr. Pravin Kumar Jugnauth, and the government and people of the Republic of Mauritius for your excellent hosting of this conference in this beautiful city of Balaclava. Thank you, thank you, thank you very much. Your Excellencies, friends, partners, and delegates, I welcome you to this 17th edition of the African Economic Conference, the annual convening of African experts, researchers, policymakers, private sector, and civil society to think deeply about Africa's development challenges and create solutions, innovations, and technologies to solve them. I know that this year's conference will not be different. You will do exactly that. Not looking at the challenges of climate change, but confronting them to find solutions, develop technologies, come up with policies, innovations, projects, and programs, and mobilize finance and ways of mobilizing financing to address them. As I've already been said by my colleagues from the UNDP and UNECA, the choice of this team on supporting climate smart development in Africa was very purposive. After Africa's COP at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, we need to think deeply about what Africa can do to take opportunities of the climate challenge in Africa. What Africa can do with its partners to leverage finances, technologies, knowledge, and skills to address the climate challenge in Africa. We estimate that Africa loses 7 to 15 billion US dollars per year due to climate change impacts. And this is projected to reach up to 50 billion per year by 2040. That's definitely a huge amount of resources to lose for a continent whose fiscal space is already squeezed. Africa has no choice but to adapt to climate change. Supporting climate smart development in Africa is therefore an obvious choice for Africa. This is the right direction to go. This is why at the African Development Bank Group, we have fully aligned our work program to the Paris Agreement, devoting 41% of our total investment portfolio to climate finance in 2021. 67% of this focusing on climate adaptation, the highest of all the bilateral development financing institutions in the world. Our aim is to double our climate finance commitments for the period 2020 to 2025 to reach up to 25 billion US dollars towards supporting African countries to address the climate challenge. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this AEC provides a golden opportunity for us to think differently. Think outside the box, or should I say, think without the box. Because out there lies the opportunities that we can harness to turn the climate challenge to climate opportunities for development in Africa. We need to find ways of mobilizing resources to address the climate challenge. We need to find energy mixes of countries that are practical, objective, cheap, and feasible, but also climate compliant. We need to find transition pathways that are aligned to economic development strategies of countries. We need to find ways of making the climate challenge a development objective and not a trade-off between growth and development and addressing climate change. We have several options to do this. We can develop green infrastructure. And at the COP27, you already heard of the billions of dollars of green infrastructure investments that the African Development Bank Group wants to mobilize. We need to shift to accelerating development of green infrastructure to open all the great opportunities we have in all sectors to be able to address climate change while fast-tracking development on the continent. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, while climate change is wreaking havoc across the world, it also provides opportunities for development. That is why the African Development Bank at the COP27, under the leadership of President Akinwumi Adesina, launched the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, AAP, with a goal of mobilizing $25 billion for climate adaptation in Africa. The bank is also supporting countries to insure themselves against extreme weather events, which we are now seeing many more of than before. When I started working on climate change in the 70s, we need to refer to climate risks as a high probability, low risk event. But today, it is now a high probability, high risk event because it's a reality for Africa. Last year, we had already 144 high risk climate events across the continent, from Madagascar to Sudan, to Mauritius, to all countries of the continent are experiencing different climate challenges. The bank is also launching an Africa's food supplies programs to be able to address this challenge. And that is why this year, our board approved for us the $1.5 billion food emergency program to address the challenges that's created by climate change and other headwinds that Africa's economies are facing. Ladies and gentlemen, time will not allow me to go into all the details, but I'm very sure that our smart researchers who have submitted papers to this conference will dig deep into these issues and come up with solutions. It is time for Africa to produce its own food and achieve food sovereignty. It is time for Africa to generate its own energy and achieve energy sovereignty. It is time for Africa to develop green infrastructures and be able to remain sustainable within its own global carbon budget. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we must work and think smarter. We must think African. We must leverage the huge private capital we have, up to 145 trillion of assets under management to address the climate challenge. Let's create policies that will attract these private sectors into our countries, and the climate challenge will become a history because they would earn profit, give us the technologies and smart options to be able to address the challenge. And we must link green financing with job creation for our youth and women. We must link climate change with poverty alleviation because they are one and the same things. I look forward to the deliberations of this conference to come up with these solutions because together we can, together we will, together we must. Let's stand together to address the climate challenge on the continent. Thank you, Your Excellency.
And as Professor Rama says, the time for Africa is now, period. Well, to officially open the African Economic Conference 2022, the 17th edition, it is my honor to welcome the Prime Minister of the Republic of Mauritius, the Honorable Pravind Kumar Jagannath. Sir.
Honorable Ministers, Professor Kevin Urama, the Acting Chief Economist and Vice President of African Development Bank Group, Ms. Aouna Isiakonwa, Assistant Administrator, Regional Director for Africa, United Nations Development Programme, Dr. Hanan Mosi, Deputy Executive Secretary, Chief Economist, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, members of the Diplomatic Corps, respected delegates, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and a very warm welcome to you all. I wish to express my profound gratitude to the African Development Bank, the UNDP, and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa for choosing Mauritius as the host country for the 17th edition of the African Economic Conference. It is indeed a great privilege and honor for our island to offer hospitality to the African Development Bank and its partners at such a high-profile event. I also wish to convey my salutations to all distinguished guests and delegates who are with us virtually. The theme chosen for this conference, Supporting Climate Smart Development in Africa, is extremely pertinent. Climate change is a looming threat to Africa, which is the most vulnerable region to climate disasters, according to the World Risk Report 2021. Though Africa contributes negligibly to the changing climate, with about 2 to 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions, it stands out disproportionately as the most vulnerable region in the world. Extreme weather and climate change are undermining human health and safety, food and water security, as well as socio-economic development of the continent. Small island developing states are particularly affected by climate change. Our country faces a number of inherent limitations by virtue of its geographical characteristics. These include the following. The sea level is rising at a rate of 5.6 millimeters per year at mainland Mauritius and 9 millimeters per year at the island of Rodrigues, while the global average is 3.3 millimeters per year. In some places, erosion has reduced beach width by up to 20 meters over the past decade. And the sea level rise impacts our beaches that are sustaining the tourism industry, which is a major pillar of our economy. Our landmass is small, and we are geographically isolated, with limited opportunities for economic diversification. With a limited scope for economies of scale, huge investment costs have to be borne for greening the power sector. The growing impact of climate change is expected to increase the intensity and frequency of cyclones, torrential rains, and the resulting flash floods, abnormal tidal surges and swells, dry spells, and floods adversely affecting people's lives and livelihoods, ecosystem services, and the economy. The widespread impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the Mauritian economy in 2020, in particular on the tourism industry, and the Wakasho oil spill incident in the same year have shown that the island is highly vulnerable to external shocks. Major disruptions to global value chains and higher oil prices have triggered a rise in food prices, combined with climate variations threatening crop output and our food security. Ladies and gentlemen, as a small island state, we have to operate in an increasingly globalized and competitive world economy, with the dire consequences of climate change and ramifications of the Ukraine-Russia war. We walk the tightrope of balancing economic growth with environmental stewardship. And like many middle-income countries, we face a twofold challenge: creating an environment that continues to attract foreign direct investment and enforcing a regulatory framework to protect our people, natural resources, ecosystem services, and the economy from the impact of climate change and disasters. Climate change is a high priority matter on the governance agenda. We are fulfilling the obligations of every climate-related multilateral agreement. Since the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015, we have mobilized considerable resources at the domestic level. We have spent the equivalent of $150 million in support of our climate agenda in the past 5 years. In 2018, the government revamped the National Environment and Climate Change Fund by providing $50 million in support of flood mitigation measures such as rehabilitation of degraded coastal zones and solid waste management. Mauritius is spending about 2% of its GDP on environment and climate change related policies. We have more ambitious targets in our revised 2021 nationally determined contribution. Our Climate Change Act became operational in April 2021. The objective of this legislation is to implement the obligations of Mauritius under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and other related instruments on climate change. Climate change and environmental degradation have emerged as a cross-cutting issue to players in different fields, including central banks. And in this regard, the Bank of Mauritius has set up the Climate Change Center in 2021 to spearhead efforts in measuring, analyzing, managing, and mitigating climate change risk. The Bank of Mauritius has also established a regulatory framework for issuing sustainable bonds and guidelines to banks and non-bank deposit-taking institutions on climate-related and environmental financial risk management. Mauritius intends to develop an environmental, social, and corporate governance with the objective to position our country as a sustainable international financial center and to encourage environmental, social, and governance compliant investments from financial institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, Mauritius aims at phasing out the use of coal for electricity production by 2030 and increasing the contribution of renewable energy by 60% in the electricity mix by 2030. Moreover, the rise in the petroleum prices caused by the Russia-Ukraine war rekindles our motivation to shift away from fossil fuels and be self-sufficient in electricity production. Several measures are being taken to decarbonize the energy sector in general, including the adoption of electric vehicles. In order to face the challenges of climate change more effectively, SIDS need the support and assistance of the development partners. We acknowledge and commend the African Development Bank for its leadership role on climate adaptation in Africa and globally. We understand that the share of climate finance dedicated to adaptation is 67%, which is the highest among all multilateral development banks. Moreover, the African Development Bank, the Global Center on Adaptation, are implementing the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program with the goal of mobilizing $25 billion in climate adaptation financing in Africa. The bank is also supporting countries to ensure against extreme weather events through its Africa Disaster Risk Insurance Facility and to secure Africa's food supplies in the face of climate change through its Feed Africa strategy. The question of mobilization of the funding is persistently put on the table of major world summits, including at the recent COP27. Climate finance is indispensable for SIDS like Mauritius to cope with adaptation and mitigation challenges imposed by climate change. In this regard, we urge our development partners to channel more resources to SIDS so as to reinforce their adaptation and mitigation capacity. We also hope the conclusions and deliberations from this conference will provide concrete means to implement the COP recommendations. Having said that, it is now my honor to declare the 2022 edition of the African Economic Conference open. I wish you all fruitful deliberations in the quest for a climate resilient development of Africa. And I also wish you a pleasant stay in Mauritius and hope that the warm Mauritian hospitality will live up to your expectations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your hospitality, Honorable Prime Minister. We are now going to take a short comfort break, and we're going to kick off with our plenary sessions at 10:15. So if I could kindly ask you to be back in the plenary hall at 10:15, where we're going to hold a dynamic discussion on leadership needed to achieve a just transition in Africa. Thank you, sir.